Firstly, I'd just like to obviously acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and bring greetings from my own peoples, the Quandamooka peoples from Injiribah, or as you may know it, North Stradbroke Island, which is just off the coast of Brisbane. And obviously pay my respects to my own elders, including the boss, my mum, who you all know very well, Dean Parkin. Yeah. Who has, alongside my other elders, absolutely provided the guidance and wisdom for me and my sister Stephanie, who's also here today to do the things that we do in our lives and we do in our professions. And as with everything that I'll talk to you about today, none of what I'm doing, none of what we are doing as a campaign is new or is ours. This is something that has been part of a legacy, a history that we are deeply, deeply connected to, and indeed the future that is yet to come. So I feel that acutely. I feel that very specifically right now in this campaign, and on this issue of truth-telling and reconciliation is what I'm here to talk to you about today. Just again to reiterate, I am the director of the Yes campaign for the referendum this year on The Voice. That is something that is going to be visited upon every single person in this room and 18 million other Australians around the country. And when it comes to truth-telling and reconciliation, we're in it right now. This truth-telling and reconciliation is not just some abstract process that is going to happen and complete sometime in the future. We are in it right now. This year, this referendum in October, in 6 months' time. In 6 months' time, everyone in this room, every single one of you and every voting Australian will be casting a vote in a polling booth, middle of October, and you will be making the most definitive statement that you can make about truth-telling and reconciliation in our lifetimes. It's not in the future, it's coming. It's going to tap every single one of us on the shoulders. And we're going to have to give an answer. It's not actually about the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition or the government or any political party. Very deliberately so. None of what is happening this year is an accident. None of it's been rushed, as I'll talk about in a second. It has been a very deliberate strategy to get to this point. And you all, in some ways, whether you like it or not, have a role to play. We're going to be asked a very simple question. What is this question of truth and reconciliation that I'm speaking of? We're going to be asked very simply, should we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, First Peoples of this country, and should there be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? Now, they're not the exact words. The exact words have been released and are currently being debated. But the 2 points that you'll be asked to vote on, yes or no. Should we recognise Indigenous peoples in this country as the First Peoples of Australia? And should they have a voice? It is as simple as that. You will not be asked to vote on option A of the voice versus option B of the voice versus option C. You won't be asked to say, well, is 25 or 30 or 50 representatives good or bad? You won't be asked to judge the model, how it will give its advice, how people are chosen. You will not be asked those questions. If you listen to some of the debates, you would be forgiven for thinking that that would be your job. But it is not. The job of the Australian people is to say, Should we recognise Indigenous peoples? And should we have a voice? That is it. That is what will be faced, all of us, this year. I'm going to get back to what that actually means and why that. But I just want to go back a little bit and just talk about how we got here. It's been forgotten a little bit. There's been a lot of frenzied commentary about what this is supposed to be about, and a lot of it is wrong. There's been a lot of bad faith conversations that are not truthful about this issue. So it's important that we understand the history of this as much as we can, so we can clearly and deeply understand how it is that we are in this position, that all of us will have to exercise our responsibility in 6 months' time. Now, I could go back, right back, 1770, 1788, 1901 when the Constitution was drafted. I'm not. I'm going to keep it pretty tight, historically speaking. 30 so years. 1991, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, a massive exercise in understanding the truth of what was happening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the incarceration in this country. It's important to note that back when the Royal Commission was founded and handed its findings, Indigenous people, about 14% of the adult prison population in this country. We're now at about 30%. So since 91, we've gone backwards significantly. But back in 1991, the Royal Commission hands down its findings, and in response to that, in 1991, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was formed. That is the formal start of the reconciliation movement in this country. The Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation is now known as Reconciliation Australia, an organisation that many of you are very familiar with in the work that it does. A year later, the High Court hands down its Mabo decision. Then Prime Minister Paul Keating says, all right, there's going to be 3 parts of our total response to Mabo. How do we deal with this historic decision? He says there should be 3 things. Firstly, the Native Title Act, which we have seen exercised across the country to fairly good effect for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In some places of the country, we're nearly getting to full claim in terms of the land that can be claimed, so that is good. But the second part was because there's a whole bunch of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, through no fault of their own, through the acts of colonisation, removal from country, that could not participate fully in native title, and we've seen some pretty bad cases where that has been rejected. So native title, number 1. Number 2 was the Indigenous Land Fund that was created. That was effectively used the purpose was to purchase land for Indigenous peoples who couldn't get native title so they could get some access to their lands back. That also continues to exist today in a large fund that sits on the side of the Future Fund. So Native Title Act, Land Fund were created. The third part, Keating said, well, that deals with the land and the waters. What about everything else? So he asked our voice at the time, ATSIC, to come up with a package of proposals to say, well, what is this last piece? And it was known as the Social Justice Package. So ATSIC went away in 1994 and they reported back in 1995. And the report that they came back with was called Recognition, Rights and Reform. So in and amongst these other issues like treaty and social justice and better service delivery, things that we're still talking about today, ATSIC came back with a report, an enormous consultation across the country with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, yet another one that we've done time and time again, asking the same questions time and time again, not resolving the issues time and time again. ATSIC came back and said recognition, rights and reform, and in amongst that report, they said we should absolutely, as one of their main agendas, recognise Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution. So when people say, oh, this recognition piece, this voice piece, It's all been kind of rushed. Only if you've been asleep for the last 29 or so years. Recognition, rights and reform. I'll say two things about that. The voice at the time that was tasked with delivering that report no longer exists. And the body that replaced it to be our voice, the National Congress, also no longer exists. So when we're talking about having a constitutional guarantee to the voice, is it any wonder that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples will be saying, well, we want this voice, but we want it in such a way that it's not subject to the whim of governments, because their history on this is not good. Let me just put it that way. The second thing I'll say about that report is think about the people that were involved back then. Auntie Lowitcho Donahue was at the time. Uncle Charlie Perkins, unfortunately no longer with us. Uncle was the chair of the committee that drafted the report. His daughter Rachel is now at the forefront of this campaign. And two of the co-authors were Patrick Dodson and Linda Burney. So the people that are tasked with leading this now, they know that this is not a new cause. They know that this is not a new mission. They know that this is something that the time has come now. So we had the reconciliation movement kick off in a formal way just prior to the recognition movement kicking off. And these two have run in parallel over the years. And obviously we've seen things with reconciliation. We had the bridge walk, the magnificent bridge walk in 2000, hundreds of thousands of Australians marching in support. We're going to need you to do that again. Bigger this time. And the recognition movement went, and it took a slightly different route. It sort of went quiet for about a decade. And then it was actually John Howard in 2007 that picked it up again and said if he was elected at the 2007 election, he'd hold a referendum within 18 months on recognising Indigenous peoples in the Constitution. Well, there was actually another event that happened before that in 1999. Actually, in the last referendum that this country saw, we all talk about the Republic, but we don't really talk about the fact that there was a other proposal that went to the people on that day, which was to insert a preamble into the Constitution to recognise Indigenous peoples. It sunk like a stone. It got defeated as well. Primarily because nobody had actually asked Indigenous peoples ourselves, did we even want it? It was thrust upon. So it went down too. Then it was 2007, they do it again. Obviously 2007 was the Kevin 07 election. Howard never delivered. Rudd said he would. And ever since then, this question of recognition has been subject to more than a decade of committees, expert panels, parliamentary processes. I think we're up to about 9 publicly funded, government-endorsed processes and to look at this question. We're still in one right now as we speak. It's to report in 12 days' time. Hopefully it is the last. It will be the last until the referendum. And about 11 or 12 reports. Again, this is not a new issue. The work has been done in terms of what is being proposed. But it is important to note, it wasn't until 2016 really, that after all of this examination and all the years since recognition, rights and reform, it was decided maybe we should ask Indigenous people what meaningful recognition would look like to them. Seemed like a late idea, but one. So that is how we ended up with the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I want to make a couple of comments because, as it was mentioned in my very lengthy bio, I was involved in that process. I was involved in the regional dialogues that consulted with people across the country. I was involved in the Uluru National Constitutional Convention. I got to stand in every single one of those rooms and hear what people said, and then had the great privilege of signing the Uluru Statement in 2017. That's where my conviction for this campaign comes from, because it is grounded in the voices of our people across the country. Let's be really clear about a couple of things about the Uluru Statement. We're approaching the 6-year anniversary. In a couple of weeks' time, 26th of May, it'll be 6 years. Sometimes that feels like a long time. Sometimes the memories that I have from that are just like last week. Let's be clear about a couple of things. The Uluru Statement was not a fait accompli. It wasn't part of a terms of reference of a process that had been set up to say you're going to consult all these people and then come up with a historic consensus and you're going to put it in a document and you're going to call it the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It evolved out of this process. As we went around the country talking to people, getting the views, hearing the experience of people, answering this question, what does meaningful constitutional recognition look like? That is how the Uluru Statement came to be. It came from the wisdom of our people in communities. Another thing, so the Uluru Statement could very well have not existed. It came about because we worked towards it and said, this is what we need. The second thing about it is truth-telling wasn't part of the agenda, the formal agenda that was taken to the mobs to discuss these things. In terms of the 5 options that were canvassed for recognition, the voice was one and treaty was discussed and others were. Truth-telling wasn't on the papers. It came from the people. It came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who said we cannot talk about these issues of recognition and treaties and all of these other things that are important to us without also having a real conversation about the truth. The deeper truth. The institutional truths about our nation. Who we are. Who we have been. And who we want to be. That's what makes, amongst other things, this referendum. I don't like using necessarily terms fork in the road because there's one choice and then there's another choice, and I'm only focused on one choice. That's this one. But we don't get many options. We don't get many opportunities. Nations don't get many opportunities to mark a decisive moment in their history that says the people have chosen this as the nation that we want to be. We're either leave it to the politicians to decide and hope that they get it right, or we just go through multi-decade processes and we can get to the end of our lives and say, well, we think we achieved something there. We feels like we did, but without that rattling certainty of a yes or no question. That's what we're going to get this year. So, truth-telling came from the people that said, this is what we must do as a country. Now, on truth-telling, so you can start to see, and again, truth-telling is not a new concept. You know, we have a debate every year. It starts just after Christmas. It goes and builds in fever until it hits the 26th of January. Yeah? Well, that debate's been going on for about 100 years, 150 years. That's a campaign. In a month's time, we're going to celebrate NAIDOC Week. NAIDOC was founded. The committee, the idea of NAIDOC was founded because people were campaigning to change the date. So anytime somebody says, and this has been said to me many times over this nearly 6 years since Uluru, anytime anybody says, let's just do truth-telling first, it's easy, let me assure you, it is not. It takes time. And you don't divorce these things from each other. It's not this neat process where we do voice first, and then we do treaty, and do truth-telling. Truth-telling is woven the whole way through. And as I say, we are in it right now. And we will reach that decisive moment in about 6 months' time. So that is happening. That is part of this. So you can start to see. Now, again, I want to reiterate this. As important as Uluru was, the Uluru Statement was, it is, I wouldn't say simply, but it is part of a continuum where these strands of reconciliation, these strands of truth, these strands of recognition, and these strands of voice started to come together in a real meaningful way. And we get a conclusion. We are going to get a conclusion in 6 months' time. I'm very excited about that. It obviously vests an enormous responsibility on those of us that are campaigning for this. But I see this as a historic opportunity for all of us. As I say, one that doesn't get visited upon us very often. We actually get that chance to make a statement, to embrace and to feel some peace, which has evaded us so far about who we are. And I would say, more importantly, who we want to be. So, just on what we're actually talking about here now, I want to say last thing about the two things. I've always got extra things to say. I've got to be kept to account for this. Two things to say about Uluru that, again, sometimes get lost. Firstly, it was an invitation to you all. There's a line in the statement which I love. It's a line in the middle. It's never really been caught up in the debate, but you've got to understand this line to understand the intention behind why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people proposed what we proposed. It goes, with substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. I'll say it again. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Understand, there's a lot being said about the dire consequences of what's going to happen if this referendum gets up. The sky, if you listen to some people, will come crashing down. I'm old enough to remember those same dire warnings during the Mabo decision and the subsequent Native Title Act negotiations. If those predictions had come true, none of yous would own a backyard pool because blackfellas would. Yeah? We were going after your backyards your floaties, your pools, yous that only have front yards. That didn't happen, did it? Never intended to. The same thing we're hearing now, end of democracy as we know it. I mean, we're talking about global uncertainty and threats. If our democracy can't handle an advisory voice to Parliament, we're in bigger trouble than this referendum. It is part of the counter campaign to confuse and scare people. It's an old one. It's a very old campaign. It's been dusted off. We've got to resist that. But you've got to understand that's not the intention of any of this. Fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. We all benefit. This isn't a project for just the 3% of the population. This isn't just a special measure that the 97% benevolently hand out to the 3%. This is about all of us. Understand, when we do recognition, when we actually achieve the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this country, 234 years into the modern Australian national project, we're saying something about ourselves, about who we are. Something that may seem obvious, but actually hasn't never been done before. That we're not 234 years old, that parts of us are. Some good parts of us are. But the story of what it means to be genuinely and uniquely Australian in this world has its roots in 65,000 years of history. And if we want to consider ourselves genuinely and uniquely Australian in the world, this is the opportunity. We're not the only country with a democracy or a European colonial heritage. We're not the only country that has fine landscapes and ideas of mateship. We are the only country that's home to the oldest continuous culture on earth. And when we make that statement, that very simple statement, that is a story that every Australian, no matter whether your family's been here 6 generations or you arrived 6 weeks ago and consider this your home, that is a story that you can connect to about what it genuinely means to be connected to this place. That is something for everybody. So the intention for this is absolutely about a more inclusive and a more unified nation. Others will talk about division. That is not where this has come from, and that is not where we want to arrive. It is about bringing us together. The second thing I'll say about Uluru is the unity piece. We're doing this now, this referendum, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people made a very strategic choice. You look at some of the other statements that have been made, big, powerful political statements by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples over the decades. Barunga Statement, Yirrkala Bark petitions, the Larrakia petitions, powerful statements of attempting to articulate from the perspective of the first peoples of this country the kind of nation we might be able to be. And these statements get presented in the greatest of goodwill and faith to the Prime Minister of the day, the government of the day. They are taken with much fanfare and photography. They are taken to Canberra. They're hung up on walls. You can still see them there now as decorative art pieces because they're beautiful. And they sit there unanswered, not acted upon. We'd learned our lesson. We didn't do that with the Uluru Statement from the heart. There's a reason why it's not hanging in Canberra. We didn't give it to the government or the Prime Minister. They weren't invited. No cameras. We gave it to you. We gave it. Sorry, I haven't done this for a while. We gave it to you because that's where we put our belief. That's where we put our belief and conviction. And I think we're going to be right. I think we got it right. In fact, I know we got it right. The current debate at the political level shows they're not up for this. We're not going to leave it in their hands this time. That's why we're asking you this year. Recognising Indigenous peoples as the first peoples of this country, and you mob saying, yeah, we should have a voice. It's as simple as that. I want to thank you all in the church for your commitment to this cause all the way through. As you were in 67, you were a big part of helping us get that referendum over the line. And I believe with all of you, as individuals, as an organisation, as a community, you're going to help us get there again this year. Thank you very much.